Aphra Behn's Oroonoko was first published in 1688, which is significant for two reasons. One reason is that it was the revolution happened that year when James II lost his bid to retain the monarchy and escaped to France, and William and Mary came over from the Netherlands and became king and queen of England. Mary was actually the daughter of James, and so that was that in itself is interesting too. So the other reason I think it's significant is because it was the last 2 years of Aphra Behn's life. She died in 1689, relatively young. She had turned from playwriting to novel writing in her later years, and some people speculate that the reason she did this was because she was becoming ill, and in the 17th century, in order to be a playwright, you were also the director, you were also there for the rehearsals, and so you needed to be very active physically in the theater. So we don't know actually why she changed in this respect, but that could have been one of the reasons. So the other reason for thinking about the date, though, is to really just get in your head the very important fact that she's writing this in 1688 about something that happened a long time ago, or perhaps it happened, but whether or not the actual incidents in the narrative happened, it is certainly set in the early 1660s. And one way we absolutely know this is because the English lost the colony of Suriname to the Dutch, which is actually mentioned in the narrative of Oroonoko. So it's written about an earlier time, and it's also written about a time when Charles II was on the throne, and it was written during a time that his brother James II was about to lose the throne. And so it really matters about when it was written versus when it was set. Along those lines, it's easy to think about the narrative as being told by Aphra Behn herself, and it's completely understandable if it feels like it's just Aphra Behn talking to you directly and telling you about something that actually happened to her. But I want you to step back a little bit from that impulse and think about the narrator as not necessarily the same person as the author. First of all, the narrator is actually has some facts about her that don't align with Aphra Behn's life, and the major one being the elite status that the narrator has as the daughter to the lieutenant governor who's going to arrive and save and put everything right. Once again, as in the Rover, this narrative evolves in some way around a missing father. Keep in mind that it's a story and it's a narrative, and it's not a confessional document of somebody telling you necessarily something that actually happened. So I know it kind of feels like it's somebody telling you the story, but this is very common in 18th century literature. And I mean, this is also true when we get to Robinson Crusoe. There'll be the same issue, that it's told by Robinson Crusoe, but it's actually fictional. So what is it based on? Well, having said that, I want to say the other side of it, which is that it may very well have been based on some events that Aphra Behn herself experienced. And so her biographer, named Janet Todd, has argued that it is really likely that Aphra Behn really did go to Suriname. And this used to be much disputed about whether she ever even went or witnessed these events. Whether she witnessed a slave revolt at that time, we just don't know. But we do think that she did actually go to Suriname. in the early 20th century, when Aphra Behn started to come back to critical attention, I mean, Aphra Behn was very popular at her time. Everybody knew who she was. In the 18th century, she was still very well known. This novella itself became a play in 1695. Thomas Southern turned it into a play. And it was one of the most popular plays of the 18th century, and it was, produced constantly throughout the period. So her name was known, although there was during the 18th century there was some shadow over Aphra Behn in the sense that she was considered to be improper for what their idea of a woman writer was. So she was started to be considered as a little bit scandalous in the 18th century. I mean, she was always, somewhat scandalous, but even more so in the 18th century. And then she kind of dropped out of attention for a long time, although theater historians always knew about her because she was so popular. But then in the 20th century, some early criticism started looking into her work, but it really wasn't until I think into the 80s when feminist criticism became more interesting to people, that scholars started looking at women writers and re-evaluating them and thinking about, whether are we not reading them because they weren't any good, or are we not reading them because women just weren't part of the curriculum? And so one of the arguments about this in this early rediscovering period was that the earliest 20th century criticism argues that Oroonoko was fabricated. The whole thing was fabricated, which seems like a little ridiculous to us because we know it's fiction, so of course it's fabricated. But there were kind of criticisms that she maybe plagiarized travel narratives and she never went to Suriname. And so we wanted to sort of go in a little bit between those two extremes, right? Like, and say, well, yeah, like maybe she did go to Suriname, but on the other hand, to say if it's a lie seems like the wrong category for something that's fiction. That when you start it, that the narrator tells you that this is true, and so all that is a little bit confusing. But I think there are also elements of this that are improbable, as in much fiction is not really about what actually happened in life, but it's about some sort of artistic imagination of how you could put together things that kind of maybe sort of happened to create some meaning. And so early critics would point to things like the tiger surviving with all the bullets in its heart, and Oroonoko's final death scene that doesn't seem, realistic. So the point is that we're not examining this as a documentary history to evaluate whether it actually happened or not. That I think most readers now take it as what it is, which is an artistic work of fiction that is based on may have been based on some experience that Behn had. So I think because when we start thinking about it as fiction, we can think that the narrator and Aphra Behn are not identical, so that there's a narrator that is not the same thing as the author. So if you're interested in, what does the author think, you may not be able to get to that by looking at what the narrator thinks and does, and there may be some distance, and that's something to think about as you read it. I mean, there's no real way to answer it, but I would not assume that the narrator is Aphra Behn speaking directly to you. Aphra Behn used her imagination, but she also used a lot of what she knew. She was very well read in travel narratives, and there was also some awareness of African culture. And I would point you to an excellent article by someone named Rebecca Midstein, who's recently written about how knowledge of Africa came to Europeans by way of the Silk Road trade routes. And so there was an understanding of some African customs that were influential on Europeans, and also that 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 if we think about it as fiction, we can really kind of work around questions of whether it's true, whether it's not true, whether it's realistic, or whether it's unrealistic. Parenthetically, I would also say that, and I'll talk about this a little more in a minute, that there's a case being made that this is actually the first novel, and that case has been made, and I kind of find it persuasive, because Aphra Behn is writing without really a sense of what a novel is supposed to look like, and so there are, or really any desire to create something called that we now call a novel. But what is interesting in terms of genre is that it combines elements of romance, of the 17th century genre of romance, with elements of what would in the 18th century come to be called realism, which has kind of like a minute detail of daily life and observation, and of like the physical environment, of what people look like, of what kind of houses they were in, and what sorts of emotions they were feeling in detail and depth. So that becomes part of what we expect in a novel. So it has some of those things, but then it doesn't completely feel like a novel to us in the modern sense. If it's fiction, then we can also think about, ask questions like, is there any such idea of race in this novel, and is it the same idea as our notion of race? And what about slavery? Is there a sense of slavery as a violation of human dignity? Is there any such thing even as human rights? Mostly we think of that as human rights as an Enlightenment concept, which is not been developed in Behn's time. So okay, so having laid all that out, I want to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about its narrative structure. So you could think of Oroonoko as divided into two parts, with a little bit in the beginning. But the first half is, roughly speaking, is in Coromantien in Africa, and the second half is in Suriname, in the Dutch English colony of Suriname that would later become the Dutch colony. That's set in Coromantien is actually narrated by Oroonoko and is told to you by the narrator. So you're getting it through the narrator, but the narrator only has the information given to her from Oroonoko. And so you don't have a direct speech from Oroonoko, but you know that the whole thing comes from this character, because that's her only access to information. So Coromantien is depicted as an honor culture, and as also a culture with an absolute monarch. So the grandfather, what he says goes. There's no negotiation, there's no voting, there's no democracy. There's just an absolutist authority. And it's also a warrior culture. So in this warrior culture, there's a sense of honor in terms of accomplishment, but I think also that there's a sense of the cost of a warrior culture. And one of the most obvious costs of it is that the grandfather has no children left. He only has one grandson, because all of his sons have been killed in battle. And he had a lot of sons because he had many wives. And so this culture also practices polygamy, and the grandfather has absolute sexual authority over the women in his community, which I think you'll have to agree is not really depicted as a positive thing. It's depicted as of course, as a problem, because it's what generates the tension at the beginning of the novel between Oroonoko and his grandfather. So you could see that some of the depiction of Coromantien is familiar from heroic plays of this period. And so, for example, there's the friendship between Oroonoko and Jimoan, even though they're on separate, opposite sides of a battle. They sort of like Montezuma and Goyamor, they recognize each other's greatness across difference. So on the one hand, there's that kind of dignity and recognition of greatness that comes in this, um, and a kind of friendship that can travel across boundaries. That once you recognize the honor of the other person, then you can establish a relationship, and it doesn't matter what country they're from. So I think honor here has a kind of a complicated relationship to birth. So in Coromantien, clearly there's a birth order. Oroonoko is the prince because he was born in that position. At the same time, not everybody who's well born is honorable. And I think that is also the problem with the absolute monarchy, that as you can see in her depiction of it, I mean, lots of critics say that Aphra Behn is a royalist, an absolutist, a huge supporter of the Stuarts, and to some extent that was true. But when you read this novel, it's hard to see this as complete, blind support of the authority of the monarch, because the monarch in this narrative is pretty awful. He's, selfish. He's sexually voracious, but at the same time he's impotent, and he's really not thinking about the future of his country. And so I think there's definitely an ambivalence here about that kind of structure in which absolute power comes to somebody who's born in that position. But like the heroic plays, characters in Oroonoko have a really vast emotional capacity, especially because most of what we see, as in romance, are elite characters. There are a few less than elite characters, and you'll see that they have a more limited emotional range. Like one I'm thinking of is Onahal, who's in charge of the harem, and she has a kind of simple motivation, which is that she wants to have sex with this younger man, so she's willing to arrange some things. And she's maybe slightly comic, but Oroonoko has a vast emotional range and a kind of really heroic feelings, and he has an outsized sense of honor, and he also has an outsized sense of love that goes with that. And so he is, born and raised in a polygamous culture, but he emerges as fiercely monogamous. He's only in love with Imawinda. This is the only woman he'll ever have. He'll give up everything for her. When she becomes unavailable to him in Coromantien, he goes into a depression. He can only pulls out of it with the help of his friend, his equally honorable friend Jamoan, who is his previous enemy, but now they're friends because they see the value of each other's character across that difference. And so he throws himself into battle, but there's something slightly suicidal about it, even though he survives. But he throws himself into battle because he's depressed, and he's deeply in love, and in a way that clearly the grandfather has a more narrow, a less honorable emotional capacity, because he's just very interested in kind of his own comfort and his own pleasure. And those are, in the heroic drama, those are considered less worthy. And so Oroonoko only has worthy emotions. And so so the second half of the novel takes place in Suriname, which is of course in the Caribbean, or bordering on the Caribbean. And so the narrator appears in the Suriname half. So it's only when the Coromantien part is done being told that we get to the Suriname part. So, and that's when the narrator appears, And then that's where, you know, Imawinda miraculously comes to the same slave colony. And once again, you know, this is an event which is the kind of thing that happens all the time in novels, but it doesn't really happen in travel narratives because it seems unlikely. But again, you know, it also happens in romances, in fiction, things like that happen. And you know, we as readers we learn to accept them because fiction is not a record of actual life. It's some artistic creation from life. So and also there isn't really a sense at this time of kind of immersion in something that, in a world that is separate from the world that you're living in now. So everything has some sort of relationship to the cultural landscape and the political landscape that that's happening at the time. In fact, a lot of people argue that this novel is not a novel at all, but it's a political allegory for monarchy. So when we get to the English colony of Suriname, we meet a new cast of characters, and we don't really meet a lot of them really closely, but they are the English colonists. And the English colonists are really they're not honorable figures. In fact, they're barbaric. They are driven by greed. They are gratuitously cruel. They are only interested in making money. They have no sense of honor, and they also don't really have a stake in kind of traditional social status. So what you actually see very interestingly in Suriname is a kind of capitalist economy that is not paying much attention to the traditional aristocratic ideology. And so they are there to make money. They are depicted by Behn as limited emotionally, and also entirely without honor. And so I think if we think back to Hobbes, I think these are exactly the people who would need to be controlled by fear and violence, because there's really nothing else that would control them. And so they're kind of Hobbesian figures in that sense. They're although there's a little Hobbes throughout the whole novel. The colonial order is not really being controlled by the English social order. It's more of a free-for-all and more of an expression of raw power, a location where raw power is what really matters. So Oroonoko and Imawinda are anomalous in terms of social status in that world, because many people recognize their royalty, and they're not put into working in the fields. They're kind of recognized as different by birth, and yet they're not recognized. They're still enslaved. So another group that's important to notice in Suriname are the other enslaved people who are enslaved with Oroonoko and Imawinda. And they, being from Coromantine, they recognize Oroonoko as their king, even though he may have actually sold some of them into slavery, because, as you recall, Oroonoko was himself a slave trader. Solidarity with Oroonoko because they owe him obedience, but at the same time, they're not as brave, they're not as heroic, they're not warriors. And so they don't really they're not depicted as understanding enslavement as an affront to their honor, which is what Oroonoko sees his enslavement as. So they have a very different response. They certainly don't like it, and they are willing to rebel with him to a point, but then other considerations take over, like the male enslaved males are worried about their women and children being vulnerable, which interestingly is kind of the same thing that ends up bringing Oroonoko down too. Captain of the ship is an interesting figure is along this spectrum that I've been building about honor and emotional capacity and the scarcity of emotion that we see in the lower class figures, and the abundance of emotion that we see in Oroonoko and in Mwenda. So he also lacks honor, and we know this because he lies to Oroonoko. But he's interesting because he's not like the colonists. I mean, he's not barbaric. He's actually kind of refined. He's an intellectual. The reason Oroonoko likes him is because they have intellectual conversations. He tempts Oroonoko onto the ship by telling him that he's going to explain how the navigational instruments work. So he doesn't like tempt him with, wild parties, but with intellectual scientific pursuits that they both share a great interest in. But he turns out to be a very chilling figure because he actually recognizes that what he's doing is dishonorable in a way that the English colonists have no concept of honor at all. But he sees what he's doing is dishonorable, and yet he does it anyway. And I think, to me, one interesting thing about this figure is that he does refer to himself as acting on behalf of his king. And just a little reminder here that king would be Charles II. So he is acting on behalf of Charles II. And as we learned, Charles II had a huge investment in the African slave trade. And so he is part of this. If it's in the early 1660s, he's part of the Royal Adventurers into Africa. And he's an English captain. He's not one of the other slave trading nations. He's English. So there's a lot of talk about, and a lot of very interesting discussion in the criticism of Oroonoko as like Oroonoko himself as representing Charles I because he's a king who's beheaded, or Oroonoko as representing James II because he's a monarch who's not listening carefully enough to his people, and he's also going to be betrayed by his people. And there's a very famous article by someone named Laura Brown who argues that that both Charles I and Oroonoko were both destroyed together by capitalism, which is what the slave trade represents. But at the same time, within the parameters of the story, it's the captain who like literally represents the king. Oroonoko may represent him in a literary way, but the ship's captain is literally acting on behalf of the monarch, and specifically on behalf of Charles II. So royal dignity is undermined by slavery in this play, but royal ambition is also behind slavery in this play. So I think that's something to think about. So where is the narrator in all this? If we think again, as I'm suggesting, of the narrator as a character. Yeah, well, she's kind of a challenge in this respect because she definitely sees herself as superior to the other colonists. I mean, she really looks down on them. And you can see why, because they're horrible and they're greedy and they're crude and they, don't have any kind of refinement or sophistication. They're just brutes, and they just want to use other people to get whatever they can out of them. On the other hand, she's kind of implicated in this system as well. She's certainly benefiting from it. At the same time, she's able to establish this wonderful rapport, at least from her point of view, with Oroonoko. So one way in which she's different from the other colonists, is that she recognizes Oroonoko as an honorable figure. So it's kind of just like just like in Coromantien, there were honorable figures on both sides of the war and dishonorable figures on both sides of the war, and the honorable figures bonded with each other. So there's a period in the novel where I think the narrator sees herself as one of those honorable figures who's bonding with an African prince, and sees herself as being elevated by being in his presence. And so she's at the same time, she's also working on behalf of the English colonists, because her job is to prevent him from being so unhappy that he rebels. So she's trying to entertain Oroonoko and Imawinda so that they don't disrupt this very delicate balance of power in the colony. And of course it doesn't work. When he, when Imawinda turns out to be pregnant, he decides that he will not tolerate his progeny being transformed from royal stock to enslaved status. And so that's what motivates him to rebel. So the narrator, as a character, really fails in her job of appeasing him, and it's just too much of a dislocation for him to really endure that, even though he is mostly free. He isn't really suffering in a physical sense. He's not working in the fields, but his dignity is affronted, and he is indignant because people below him, who he sees as below him, that is the English colonists, are giving him orders and acting in a way that he considers impertinent, and so that motivates him to rebel. So certainly lots more to say about this novel, but I'll stop there. That's a general overview of the characters and of the tensions, and I will talk more about some of the problems that the narrative raises.